One of the big differences in practical life at a 3 to 6 level and a 0 to 3 level is they want to work with us for a while before they reach that stage of being interested in doing something completely independently. We know what their motor skills are like. We know what parts they understand, and often their understanding is much deeper than their motor skills. But there's also another aspect. They like to work with us.
Some of the water went on the other side of the shelf. Bring a cloth and I'll show you where it is. Our model's so wet it doesn't dry anymore. Let's close this. It's not over here. Look, the water ran under the shelf. See, it's coming from under there. So we need to dry this with our dry cloths.
This idea of collaborative work, how it begins that way, coming, I think, primarily from the child's desire to work with an adult, gradually morphs into the child being able to do something independently. But I think we have to be so careful about not pushing them prematurely into independence, but to allow them as much as possible the collaborative work until they choose to move into a piece of work independently. I think part of the desire of a child to do collaborative work stems perhaps from the whole concept about attachment. Attachment for every child needs to occur very early in life. From this primary attachment, a child then moves within their family circle, attaching to more and more people, and then gradually outside that family circle. So from that primary attachment comes the security to be able to attach to others.
You want to say hi to Miss Gabby?
Should we go put your things away?
Yeah.
Yeah. Go this way. Let me put the door. What's your bag?
Okay.
What's your tote bag? Do you remember? These are your slippers. Your slippers.
When a child comes into a nido or an infant community, there's a transition, there's a secondary or tertiary attachment to one of the adults in the environment. And part of that desire to do collaborative work, I think, stems from creating that attachment, that other attachment, and then the child moves into independent functioning.
Would you like to do some orange juicing? Okay, let's come over.
This has to be done in a sensitive way so that the child's needs can be met, because we don't want to give too much help and we don't want to give too little help. Different children need longer periods of this collaboration, of this time where the adult is observing to see what does the child need.
Sometimes the child's ability to do something independently and the child's desire to do something independently are very different. There are two kind of streams of development that support functional independence. Cognition, what is it I'm supposed to do? How do you do that? Why would you do that? And what are the motor skills required to do that? Most children understand long before they have the motor skills to show us that understanding. In that stage, particularly, adults interfere too quickly. They step in to stop a child from having to struggle because their motor skills aren't quite there yet. They step in prematurely, and they take away that thrill of having accomplished something from that struggle. It doesn't mean we let them struggle to the point of sheer frustration, but we don't step in prematurely either. And when we don't, when we allow children to show us what they really are capable of doing, we see great strides in functional independence. I think one of the safest things we can do is to communicate to that child, show me the parts you need help with, and only help with that part. Or ask me when you need some help. If we can create a communication with the child so that we know when the frustration is about to erupt, we can step in just beforehand.
Now, when you see a child, just try to do it like any infant. You start talking to them, immediately they answer with their eyes. Immediately they try to babble back to you. So it's like someone is talking to me, like someone is recognizing me. But not just in that. If you show them anything, a toy that they can open or close or they can move, anything that is moving is attractive for them. And when they can move it, then they smile because they see, oh, so I can collaborate also in this environment. I can also make something change. I can transform the environment myself. So it is a human condition to be acting upon the environment.
The most important aspect of a community of young children is that human relationship. The human environment is so much more important for young children than even the physical environment, because that is where children are learning how humans relate to each other, how they deal with each other, how they treat each other. Is there respect? Is there a sense of acceptance? Not necessarily of all behaviors, but certainly acceptance of every child for who they are. Is there humor? Toddlers are very funny creatures. So can we laugh with them? Never at them, of course, but can we really giggle with them? Can we celebrate? Is there a celebration of life every day in a community? Celebrating life together sometimes involves food. Do we make it a celebration? Do we really set a beautiful table, and do we present it as fine dining with flowers and with perhaps even candles? But to really celebrate life through the use of food, which human populations do everywhere. We also have to develop very sharp observation skills, because that is our biggest tool. It's our biggest tool at all levels, but especially with 0 to 3, because so many of the children don't have the language skills yet. We get most of our information by observing. For example, if a child is using a piece of material in a way that we haven't shown them, we need to wait, see what they're doing with it, see what need is being addressed by their use of that material, and then decide if it's okay for them to do what they're doing.
It's not only about ability and what they can do, it's also about what they're interested in. And so we have to observe to know, okay, this child is practicing climbing. He really wants to be on this table all of the time. And instead of me trying to say, no, get off the table all the time, I need to give him something that satisfies that need so that he can practice it. So I'm going to provide a simple milk crate, for example, on the floor that he can climb up and down, and I'm going to show him and model for him how to use that. And that's where he can do that movement. So I'm looking for that as well. I'm looking for putting the child into the correct work for his development.
Observation often becomes the forgotten child. Sometimes we think if someone observes us sitting and observing, they think we're not working. But the more objective notes we have written, the more data we have to reflect on to know how best to serve the needs of a young child. Many people, when they're observing young children, react from what they feel about what they see rather than what they see. So they react from an emotional perspective, which may or may not be accurate for what they're observing. It's a practice we have to school ourselves in. We have to make a commitment to doing. I think it's a practice that also we need to train all of the support staff in our environments. Give them some ideas, give them an idea of the importance of observation in what we're trying to do as a team, and make it part of their job description as well. Every day or every other day, I want you to sit for even 5 minutes or 10 minutes and just choose a child and write down what you see them doing, not what you think their motivation is, but what you actually see them doing. We're used to seeing and thinking about concentration with children, older children, children who can take a piece of work, sit down, engage themselves in this, totally lose themselves in a piece of work, and after a certain period of time, come out of it looking very fulfilled, very peaceful, very knowledgeable. Traditionally in Montessori, we've had that as the model for concentration. But with children under, let's say under 2.5, they do concentrate, but it looks very different. Children under 2.5 are magnetized by language. So they may be deeply engaged in a piece of work, but if suddenly they hear language somewhere that is of interest to them, they'll stop what they're doing, they'll turn and look toward that language that's going on, watch until they're no longer interested, and then return back to their work. To me, that's a form of toddler concentration. But we're so used to not thinking about tiny children concentrating that unconsciously we interrupt it, and that disrupts that natural flow of it. And by the time they get to be toddlers then, they're often seen as not concentrating, but I see it as concentration. They go back to the same piece of work with little moments of being attracted to something else going on. They go back to the same piece of work. So to me, that's toddler concentration. It's going to build toward what we see in older children.
It's magic if all the children are working at the same time and you're not giving any lessons, but you're observing. And in the meantime, you've also trained the other adults in the environment to be able to work with some of the materials. That is not the case in a primary environment. Usually the teacher or the guide is the only one that gives lessons. But in a toddler environment or an infant community, the children don't see a difference between the adults, and they will go to any of the adults, and sometimes they bond with certain adults, and they will only work with those adults. So it's really important that the other adults in the environment are trained, especially on language lessons, because you could give language lessons all day long in an infant community, and there still wouldn't be enough language for these children who are so hungry and are in that sensitive period for language.
This language explosion, this spoken language development, is simply going to speed up in an infant community because they're surrounded by so much language and good language models from all of the adults in the environment. We do have language materials in an infant community of 3 or 4 different kinds, but the most important language material still is the language of the adult. On our training courses, we say that in order for spoken language to develop, there are 4 necessities. One of them is that the child has to be able to hear, so the whole auditory apparatus and the neural structures supporting that have to be healthy and normally functioning. They have to have healthy functioning vocal apparatus, so both neurologically and just the organs of the mouth, the organs of speech. Those 2 things, as a practitioner, we can't do very much about. We can recognize maybe when a child has an ear infection, but we really can't remedy issues there. The other 2 things, the child has to be in a spoken language environment, and a child has to have a desire to speak. The desire to speak, how do we support that? That goes back to being willing to listen, actively listen, and to acknowledge every communication attempt, whether it's a coo, whether it's a babble, whether it's a word that not very clearly articulated. Especially in this 3-year period, children need to be surrounded by adults who think their communication attempts are fabulous. And they really get down to their level, look them in the eye, if that's culturally appropriate, and really give the idea, I am interested only in what you have to say in this moment. And I find it fascinating. That encourages a child, at no matter what level they're at in terms of spoken language development, to continue to use whatever skill they have to communicate.
It's supposed to be so nice today. Should we go play outside?
Yeah. Nice outside.
It's nice outside.
The adults need to support each other in situations where groups might get too large, or if you're sitting on one side of the classroom and then there's another child at the sink who might need some assistance because the water is starting to overflow onto the floor. So you need to really collaborate with each other and support each other. And you might be that person if your assistant is busy with children that are taking shoes off from coming in the morning, something like that. So come up with a system so that you can support each other.
When a child comes into an infant community at 14, 15, 16 months, whenever they're really stable walkers, they can be in this community until somewhere between 2.5 and 3. If they're in there for a year, they've basically mastered most of the materials in there. And their behavior begins to change significantly. Their behavior can become a little difficult, almost overnight it seems, because the materials they're working with might still challenge some of their motor skills, but intellectually they're not as challenged. And so this becomes a transition period between 2.5 and 3. So this also requires a lot of communication in a school staff. If you leave these children too long in an environment that does not suit their needs, then when they do transition, we often label them deviated behaviors. Now, we know in Montessori that term, deviations, simply means behavior that is no longer following the normal behavior for this child. So this transition period is very critical. Now, in an infant community, these children are laying the foundations for all the work that's going to come in the 3 to 6 environment. We remember they're still deeply exploring the world they live in, and they're using their senses to make this exploration. All of this information they're taking in is setting the stage for the sensorial materials at the 3 to 6 environment. The names of the practical life materials may sound the same in an infant community and a casa, but the actual work is so different. So for example, we do a very simplified wood polishing exercise for a toddler. And then we would explore how can we make this simple exercise more challenging for 3 to 6-year-olds? What steps can we add? What challenges, intellectual and motor-wise, can we add? So this moving back and forth with materials that sound the same but are in fact very different is a great way of transitioning children into a 3 to 6 environment. However, if that transitioning child is only given opportunities for practical life, when their little intellects are on fire, we turn them off. And especially if the practical life is extremely simple. If we think they've been washing tables and arranging flowers and doing laundry and washing dishes and baking bread, and then they move into a casa and they're given bean spooning and corn pouring, they will do some very interesting things with those exercises.
The water bin under the shelf.
This deep trust in the adults that they've been working with and this human connection they've made sets that foundation that says in this community, whether it's this room or the next room, but in this Montessori school community, the adults here are all trustworthy and they respect me to be here and they know who I am. And I see that as such an important foundational piece for these children moving up.